Just to review the Shadow V3 before I mod it, this cube comes with a matte finish because it's a prototype I got from a friend, although the final product for this cube will actually be a UV. The external appearance of the cube is very similar to the Aoshi WRM. Both cubes are similar in size with almost similar shades, although I would say the shadow shades are a little bit darker and more vibrant, but it could also be due to the fact that my Aoshi is old and the color could have faded a bit over the years. The Aoshi holes are also a little bit bigger than the Shadow V3. Comparison, the Meilong is significantly smaller than either of the other 6x6s. Comparing the Shadow V3 with the Hong 5x5 and the Spark V2 7x7, the Shadow V3 is relatively smooth on its outer layer with a slight sandy feel, which is more comparable to the Hong, although the Hong is still a little bit smoother. On its second and third layer, however, it's quite crunchy, much like the Spark V2, although the Spark V2 is crunchy on all three of its layers. The third and the second layer have quite strong magnets in them, and they're quite similar to each other, whereas the outer layer is significantly weaker, which I do enjoy a lot. The Shadow V3 is also an inherently unstable cube. It's quite easy to deform it, and the cube relies quite a lot on its magnets and springs to rebound it back into cube shape. Still think it's a little bit more stable than the Meilong, which I actually modded a ball core into this in order to make it usable, whereas the Shadow just comes default with a ball core. Aoshi on the other hand is also just way more stable than the other two, and it's actually difficult to deform this out of cube shape. It's not a scenario where you can deform the cube and then there's a strong force pulling it back. This one is just difficult to deform even in the first place. The Shadow V3 is also lacking the anti-deforming mech, which is a mechanism that makes the second layer pieces much bigger internally than they are on the surface, and it is significantly easier to just deform this cube compared to the Aoshi. The mechanism design also features the same philosophy as the Hong and the Spark. So they all have the same hollow corner that has been around since the Wushuang. But unlike the Wushuang where there's a reverse footlock mech, all three of these cubes have now eliminated the reverse foots, and the pieces can just slide freely front and back. You can refer back to my Spark V2 video and possibly also my Hong video to compare this with the Valk 5, for example. The core corner magnets of the Shadow V3 is built very similarly to the Hong, where they pretty much just took one of their old cores and glued a ball piece on top of it, which is in turn different from the Spark, where the core itself is inherently designed to be core corner magnetized. The core magnet distance of the Shadow V3 is a little bit bigger than the Hong, so the Hong ultimately still has the stronger ball core feeling. The core magnet distance of the Shadow V3 looks to be a little bit smaller than that of the Spark V2. The core structure of the Shadow V3 is actually technologically behind the Aoshi WRM. You can see here that the Aoshi WRM uses a more modern thin core, while the Shadow V3 is still using the thick core that the Shadow V2 and Aoshi GTS would be using. This is even more evident when you compare some of the internal pieces and you realize that the Aoshi WRM can actually have a much thinner center. Here's another piece to compare. A thinner stock would mean that you have more room to expand the outer pieces this way to make them bigger. However, the Shadow V3 still manages to have a bigger corner base than the Aoshi, simply because it has a shallower radius. Overall, the Shadow V3 is a nice cube to pick up and turn, but when you come to do actual solves on it, the feedback I get from most of my friends who have tried this cube is mostly not very positive. However, I do have some intentions to try some mods on this thing and see whether the cube does improve afterwards. When it comes to objective facts, the Aoshi WRM basically blows the Shadow V3 out of the water. The Aoshi is simply faster, more difficult to pop or get deforming lockups, and massively more stable and reliable for spamming turns at high speeds in a comp setting. Even in base form with just setup and no mods, it will probably beat the Shadow in terms of stats. It's almost like Spark V2 versus Aofu WRM, but more extreme, as the Aoshi is better than the Aofu, and the Shadow pops are worse than the Spark. However, there is some subjective appeal to the Shadow V3. Firstly, it's lighter than the Aoshi, so with the Aoshi, it feels like I'm pushing more weight with less friction, while with the Shadow, I'm pushing less weight but with more friction. The slight sandy and crunchy feel also gives the cube its own unique feel and character, so overall I still got a lot of good solves on the Shadow, although I set it at a significantly tighter tension compared to the tension which I first got this cube. And now the pops are nowhere as bad as before, but considering how rarely I even pop my Aoshi, Meilong, or even Shadow V2, the V3 is a little bit of a step back in this category. When it comes to comparison against the Meilong 6x6 V2, the Meilong has moments where it can actually feel better than the Aoshi, and moments where it just feels downright unstable, while the Shadow is just more consistent. I also feel that the base Meilong is too unstable, and I modded a core corner magnets into mine, well, the shadow just has better stability, although that could partially be due to the ball core already being pre-modded into the cube. So just for the reliabilities differences, I'm going to still put the outshoot in first place, but I'll be giving the shadow second and the Meilong third. Although the Meilong is also a budget cube, so it might do better in price to performance ratio. So overall, the Shadow V3 is not terrible. It's more like an alternative option if you like some of the characteristics it has to offer.